Hey everyone, thanks for joining us today. This is the Intro into IPv4 Subnetting webinar with Keith Barker. Before we get started, as always, I just want to remind you all that you can use the chat window at any time to ask Keith any questions you might have. And Keith's going to do his best to answer some of those questions after his presentation. And finally, don't worry, we'll be providing a recording to you all via email after the webinar, as well as posting the recording on our blog, blog.cbtnuggets.com. Keith, go ahead, take it away.
All right. Hey, thanks, Anthony. And everybody who's taken a few moments to share this time with us today, a big thank you to you as well. That's the one thing that everybody on the planet has an equal amount of, and that is time. And I do realize that some people have more stuff to do than others in that time, and that especially applies to people in information technology. So I'd like you to do an exercise with me, if you would. I'd like you to imagine, if you would, in your mind, the place where you currently live. You might be in a home or a house or an apartment or a condo. Imagine the place where you live, and then think about your address. Now, obviously you may not want to share your address with strangers, but think about the address that you have at your home and how that works. Now, in most places, at least in the United States, we have several components to an address, and that also includes something called a street name and a house number. So for example, if we take a look, let me get my pen out here. I've got a really cool pen tool I'm dying to use. There we go. So this house right here, this is house number 3 on Sunset Boulevard. And so if there was mail being delivered to that person, it would be delivered to house number 3 at Sunset Boulevard, and then further we could identify the person. For example, maybe Lois, who lives in that house. And the post office, they've got this down, at least in the U.S. They're really good at delivering mail based on addresses. And of course, there's also the city and the zip code as well. Well, in computer networks, we also have something very similar to street names and house numbers. And these types of addresses are referred to as an IP address. So for example, this computer right here, if we were going to send it a packet, a message over the network, we could use a logical layer 3 address, which is very similar to a street name and house number, and it would look something like this. So if we send a packet to 30.0.0.3, what that means, at least to this computer, is that it's on a street called 3000, and it has a house number of 3 on that street. So very similar concepts to something we already know. IP addresses are basically a street name that is common to everybody on that street, and then a unique house number, except they call the house number a host ID or a host number in the world of IPv4. So that's it. Hey, thanks everybody for showing up. Okay, there is a little bit more. One of the other factors that we need to be aware of is that computers use binary numbering systems. Binary, think of it like a light switch. It can either be on, which is a 1, or off. That's it. So as us humans, we use a decimal numbering system, 0 through 9, and that's probably because we have 10 digits. So as you and I count, we can go 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and then we go to 10, carry the 1, 11, 12, 13. In binary, it's just 0 or 1, and then we can carry the 1 to the next position to the left. An IP address is 32 bits. Think of it like 32 light switches in a row, and each of those positions can either be on or off. Now, in the world of binary, in the world of computers and digital information, if we take 8 of those bits, they make up something called a byte of data. So when we talk about an IP address, in reality, it's 32 bits. However, we can logically chunk those up into sections of 8 at a time. So we could say it's 4 bytes, or 4 groups of 8 bits. It makes up an IP version 4 address. And the cool thing is that when we write out an IP address, instead of writing it out in binary, we actually write it out in decimal, because us as humans, we use decimal as our primary numbering system. So this is an example of an IP address. We have the first number of 10 represents the first 8 bits. And then we separate it with a period, and then we put the second number. In this example, it's 100. And then we separate that with a period. That's just for us so we can see where one starts and when the other stops. And then we have the third number, which is 30. And then we have the fourth number, which is 4. Now, each of those numbers really behind the scenes is representing 8 bits or 1 byte of data. Now, you might say, well, Keith, why do we care about that? The reason that you and I care about the details behind the scenes is that if we ever have to manipulate or work with or modify the way that IPv4 addresses work, we have to understand the underlying factors behind it. So I'm not, in this webinar, you and I are not going to try to master the world of binary and decimal conversion, but I did want to make you aware that an IPv4 address is basically 2 elements. It is a street name, which is a common network address that all the computers on that network live on, and each computer on that network has a unique host number, which is like a house number, and then an IP address is 32 bits long, and it's made up of those 32 bits, and we represent those bits using decimal just because it's more convenient to write them out that way. The next thing I'd like to talk with you, which is a key component to understanding IP subnetting, is the class of addresses. Now, a class of address, it's not really nice, I think, in many types or many environments to, classify things like, oh, that person's a tall person or a small person or a short person or whatever. Classification of humans sometimes isn't very nice. But with IPv4 addresses, it's perfectly okay. And there's 3 classes I want to talk with you about, and they are class A, B, and C, which means that anybody who is familiar with the alphabet, at least the English alphabet, and they also are familiar with decimal numbers, can easily identify an IP address and tell us what class it's in. And here's the secret. If the first number, the very first number in an IP address, for example, say we have x.x.x.x. We take this first number right here before the first period. If that first number is within the range of 1 through 127, that IP address is a class A address. Now, at this point, you might think, well, so what? And I would totally agree with you. We haven't discussed enough information yet to actually appreciate why that matters, but trust me, it matters. So let's try for now. I would have you jot down, if you have a notepad handy or something to write on, or if you have a notepad open in your computer, if you have the ability to jot down that a Class A address has the first number within the range of 1 through 127, I would encourage you to jot that down. Why? Because that'll help you in remembering that number and that range. Also, the actual address of 127 itself is used for a special purpose. It's a loopback address, so we can't actually apply that as an IP address in IPv4, but is still in the Class A range. So great. Class A address begins with the first number right here between 1 and 127. A Class B address has the first number that begins within the range of 128 through 191 inclusive. So I'd like you to jot that down. Is there going to be a quiz? Yes, there's going to be a pop quiz, and I want you to be absolutely ready for it. So Class B address, if you look at that first number of the IP address, and it is 128 through 191, that's a Class B address. So jot that down. And then a Class C address, that first number of the IP address, if it's within the range of 192 through 223, that would mean that the entire IP address is a Class C address. Now, what about Class D and Class other? There are other classes of addresses, but these are the only 3 that we need to worry about right now for the purpose of IPv4 subnetting. So I said there was going to be a pop quiz, and let's go ahead and do that pop quiz right now. Here's what I'd like you to do. I would like you to identify, based on these IP addresses, are they a Class A, a Class B, or a Class C address? And there's only one correct answer for each respective IP address that's shown. So I'll give you a moment. I'd like you to go through each one and think about it as a Class A, B, or C address. Now, while I know many of you are working on that, I'd like to talk to the rest of you who are not. If you didn't jot down the classes of addresses, here's a reminder. the first number, if it's 1 through 127, it's a class A. If the first number of the IP address is between 128 and 191, it's a class B. And if the first number of the IP address is between 192 and 223, it's a class C. So you should be able to, with that information, go through each of these and identify, is it class A, class B, or class C. All right. So if you've done at least a few of those, my hat's off to you. That is fantastic. Let's go ahead and take a look at the answer key. And here's the answer key for that. So again, it's so simple. You just look at the first number of the IP address and you know if it's a class A, class B, or class C. Now, my friend, why do we care about the class A or class B or class C? And the answer is we care because that controls which part of an IP address by default. I want to throw in that big time. By default, the class of the IP address controls the dividing line. Now you might say, Keith, what dividing line? Well, remember the analogy of the house and the street, the street name and the house number? Well, because an IP address is all done with numbers, we need to have some way of identifying which part of that IP address represents the street name and which part of that IP address represents the house number or host number. And the way to do that is done by something called the mask. And the default mask for a class A address says that the first number is the network and the last three numbers are going to be the actual host address or house number. In a class B address by default, the mask says that the first two numbers are the network or street name, and that leaves the last two numbers for the actual house or host number. And with a class C address, the first three numbers by default represent the network, and the last number in the class C address by default is allowed or left over for host addressing. So that's why it matters. So what we've covered so far is that an IP address is basically two components built into one. It has a street name, which is common to all the devices on a network, on that network, and a house number. We also have three classes of addresses, class A, B, and C. And the reason that matters now is because it determines the class A, B, or C based on the default mask used, whether or not or how much of the IP address is used for the network on the left and how much is left over for host addressing over on the right. So here's what I'd like you to do. I would like to apply what we've just talked about with an example. I'd like you to identify, based on these 5 IP addresses, the classes are already written in, and based on the defaults for these classes of addresses, I'd like you to identify which part of the IP address is the network portion and which is the host. And I'd like to do a couple of these with you. Let's do these together. So let's do this one right here. Because the 10, the first number, is a class A address, that means the dividing line is right here. Everything to the left of this line is the network. So it's the 10 network, and this would be the computer that has this IP address would be the host at 1.0.200. On a class B address, because it's a class B address, the default line, if you will, in the SAN, the default for the network versus the host is 50-50. The first two numbers represent the network, and these last two numbers represent the actual host on that network. So if we take one other example, let's go to a class C. What is the dividing line, and where does the dividing line go for a class C address? And if this is brand new to you, is the first time you've ever heard of this concept of a dividing line to identify the network portion on the left versus the host portion on the right, it might take a couple of times to get more comfortable. So if you're brand new and you're like, whoa, you're doing fine. Hang in there. So a class C address, by default, the first three numbers, also sometimes called the first 3 bytes or the first 3 octets. Octet is a fancy way of referring to 8 bits at a time or 1 byte of data. A class C address, the dividing line is right here by default. So a class A address, the first number is the network. A class B address, the first 2 numbers are the network. And the class C address, the first 3 numbers are the network. And everything to the right of that line by default on those networks, on those classes of addresses, would be the actual host addresses for each of those devices. So I'd like to maybe peel the onion back a little bit and show you an IP address that is broken down into binary so we can talk about how these defaults come into play with the mask. So here's an address on a computer. So I'd like you to imagine a computer. Let's say it doesn't matter what kind of computer. It could be a Macintosh. It could be a Linux box. It could be a Windows computer. It could be a router that has an IP address. It really doesn't matter. And the IP address configured on that box is 10.1.0.200. Now, by default, because this is a Class A address, the default mask is drawing the line right here, which means that the first number, which is the 10, represents the street, which in computer networking we refer to as the network. And the remaining bits, all these over here, the 1.0.200, are representing the actual host or house, the PC's house number, if you will, on that common network. And what happens actually in the background is the mask is also in binary. So the mask is simply saying, give me, give me, give me. What do you mean, Keith? Give me, give me, give me. Well, everywhere there's a bit on, this bottom line represents the mask, the default mask for a Class A address in binary. So everywhere there's a bit that's on, that's effectively the mask saying, I want that corresponding bit from the IP address to be used to represent the network. So because all 8 bits are on here, that means that the first 8 bits of this IP address, the first octet, represents the network. And that's the default for a Class A address. So we could say this several ways. We could say that a Class A address uses the first octet or first number of the IP address as the network. And the last 3 octets, or the last 3 numbers, are used for individual host or house addressing on that common network. We could also say that the default mask for a Class A address is the first 8 bits are on in that mask. That's indicating that that's the first 8 bits that we want to use for the network portion. If we looked at the mask for a Class B address, the Class B address mask would have bits that are on for the first 16 bits, and a Class C address would have the mask bits on for the first 24 bits. And that would identify the network dividing line, if you will, between the two. So the secret is this. If somebody walked up to us and they said, hey, I've got this IP address of 50.60.70.80, and they asked us which part of that is the network and which part is the actual host, we would have to know what the mask being used was. If they're using the default mask, because it's a Class A address, we could easily say, oh, the first number is the network and everything else to the right is the actual house address space. If we are not using a default mask, then we wouldn't know for sure where the dividing line is. And that, my friend, is very common in most networks because we are usually not going to be using a default mask. And here's the reason. Let's take a street. In this case, we have 10th Street. And 10th Street is representing a logical 10 network. By default, we have the 10 network, and we have all these possible house addresses that we could have on the 10th Street. The challenge with putting 3,000 or 4,000 hosts on a single IPv4 network is just too much communication going on that network. Meaning, for example, if you and I lived on a street that had 10,000 neighbors on that one street, and somebody goes out Sunday morning, they pick up their newspaper and they shout, hey, who's awake? You know, everybody's got to listen to that. Nobody has time. Ain't nobody got time for that. So in networking, what we're going to do is we're going to chop up our networks. Instead of having one network with thousands and thousands of individual computers on that network, what we can do with custom subnetting is change the rules, and we can create subnets. So whenever we hear the term subnet, it's generally referring to a smaller subsection of what was previously one bigger network. So for example here, we took 10th Street and we carved it up into 10th Avenue, 10th Place, 10th Plaza, whatever you want to do. And now we have 3 separate smaller streets They're each uniquely identified, 3 smaller networks, and then we can put hosts on each of those networks. And the way this is done is by changing the rules about using a default mask. So for example, on a Class A address, instead of using the first octet, the first number as the network, and that's it, we can simply say, you know what? I want to use the first octet, the first number, and some of the second number, or all of the second number as the address space I want to use for custom subnetting. The way we do that is we simply change the mask to accommodate that. Now here's an example from, this is from our Network Plus course at CBT Nuggets. But in this topology, what we've done is we've taken one network, the 10 network, which by default is what class of address is a 10 network? I'm going to ask that right up front. So I'm not sure how good my writing is coming through on this tool, but so there's the 10.0.0.0 network. What class of address is that IP address? And you're thinking, what? How would we know? Well, we're going to take a look at the first number, which is 10. Because that's in the range of 1 through 127, it is a Class A address. And as a result, by default, the dividing line would go right here, meaning everything to the left, meaning the 10 is the network, and everything to the right is the house numbering. However, if we change the mask, and we told the mask, even though it's a Class A address, well, let's go ahead and use the first 2 octets for the network, then what we could do is we could actually create custom subnets. For example, here we have network A, which is the 10.1 subnet, and network B, which is the 10.2 subnet, and network C, which is the 10.3 subnet, and the 10.4 subnet, and the 10.5 subnet. And that's the beauty of taking a parent, I call it, a parent IP address space, and chopping it up and carving it up to create additional, smaller, logical networks that we can go ahead and use in our infrastructure. Now, I know, I still remember back in it was like the 80s. Keith, I wasn't alive in the 80s. Well, I was alive in the 80s, alive and well. And I remember back in the 80s first learning IP addressing. And it wasn't the experience I was hoping for. I struggled a lot. And once I finally got it though, I was like, oh my goodness, this is like a huge secret that I soon found out that tens of thousands of people in my city already know how to do. But anytime you're learning a new technology, you want to make sure you can get through the learning curve as quickly as possible. So as you start working with and learning IPv4 addressing and IPv4 subnetting, I would strongly encourage you to find a resource. It might be a book or a video or a friend who can walk you through it in a very specific and methodical method, step by step, so you can make sure you get every single piece of it. And the great news is this. Once you learn it, it's a lot easier to relearn it. And you might be saying, what do you mean, Keith, relearn it? Honest to goodness, IPv4 subnetting has a shelf life. It doesn't last forever. So if you use it and learn it, and then you don't touch it for, let's say, a year or 2 years or 3 years, when you go back, you get to remember how it works. And I can tell you this firsthand experience. I teach at Cisco Live every year. They invite me to come and do an IPv4 presentation. I do a couple other things there as well. And every time before I go present, I have to go back to my notes and remind myself about the methodical process of how it can be done so it can be internalized. So I have at Cisco Live, they give me like an hour and a half or 2 hours, which is a lot better than a 30-minute, a lot more time, I should say, than a 30-minute webinar to cover some of the basic concepts as well. So what I would recommend for those of you who understanding IPv4 subnetting, the concept of taking networks and chopping it up, the concept, if you never have to do it, is just fine to be aware of. However, if you're working with servers or networks or hosts or computer systems, it's extremely likely that you're going to be involved in working with IPv4 and specifically subnets. So there's a course here at CBT Nuggets, and I say here, I'm a trainer for CBT Nuggets. It is 16 nuggets long, and the nuggets are fairly short. So for example, 7 minutes, 14 minutes, 18 minutes, 10 minutes. And what I did was, it's a little selfish, but I created the course that I wish had been created for me to learn it back in the 80s. I wish that somebody had gone. So I've done the heavy lifting and taking you through step by step. So if you're interested in really learning IPv4 subnetting, going from zero and working your way up methodically step by step, these 16 videos I would recommend doing. Also, because I realized that a lot of people may be refreshing, like myself, every time I have to go back and dive into IPv4 subnetting, at the beginning of each video, I include an opt-out question. So, for a college course, you can actually challenge the exam, and if you are challenged the course and if you have those skills, you can move on. Well, at the beginning of each of those 16 nuggets, except for the intro, which is just a short intro, on the other nuggets, I have an opt-out section. So check this out. You can read through the opt-out section. If you know the answers to the questions, you can safely say, I've got this content down. Let me go to the next nugget, and the next nugget, and the next nugget. And that way it can quickly help you remember IPv4 subnetting if you haven't touched it for a while. And I also realize there's a lot of people in IT that are going back and brushing up on their skills, and that's also why I put the opt-out questions here in this course for you. So at the end of the day, it is very simple for someone like yourself or like us to go ahead and create a IP subnetting plan and being able to identify the subnets, the range of host addresses that go in those subnets, the broadcast addresses for each of those subnets. And the reason I didn't show you this chart at the beginning is because I didn't want to scare anybody. But honest to goodness, if you spend 16 nuggets with me and go through the IPv4 subnetting course, you will, in measurable terms, be able to not only understand what this table is all about, but you could create one without using an IPv4 subnetting calculator, which is, again, a very handy skill to do because it comes in to use all the time. Additional resources, as I mentioned, I'm doing a session at Cisco Live this year. It's in San Diego. I'm sure Cisco does not mind me giving them a plug for their conference. They're going to have like close to 20,000 people there. If you happen to be going to that conference, you want to look me up, I'd love to see you. My session for IPv4 subnetting is June 11th, 10 a.m. At whatever building. I think, anyway, if you're signed up, you can find me in the online schedule for Cisco Live. And what else I wanted to point out was you can also find me on Facebook. If you've got this is my YouTube page. So I'm available on social media, and I'm there for encouragement, for troubleshooting and step-by-step hand-holding. Unfortunately, I don't have time to hand-hold everybody I would love to. I usually reserve hand-holding for people like my wife and my children. But as far as being there to help motivate you, or if you have a simple question I can answer easily or fairly quickly, I am there to help you and support you in your journey. And I've got like almost 3.5 million views on YouTube. And the cool thing is when I tell people that, they think, wow, 3.5 million views. I'm like, well, it's not like a rock star. It's like IT professionals. It's people, my people. And so we have a lot of fun, and those are resources that you can leverage as well. There's also a CBT Nuggets study community, which, shame on me, it's been out for quite a while, and I'm just getting more involved with it. It's fantastic. So if you have a subscription to CBT Nuggets and you want to join a really active community that's really supportive, that's another place to go. Also, if you're not a CBT Nuggets customer and you want to jump into subnetting or something else, we have a free 7-day trial that I would strongly recommend you check out because there's no obligation, and you can check out our courses, including, in fact, you could go through the entire IPv4 subnetting course within a 7-day trial, and that would be fantastic. We're all about it. We're all about training and education, and that would be a fantastic way to check us out. So there's some of my contact information on Facebook and Twitter and YouTube and so forth, and if we can be of assistance to you in your journey, there's nothing that, there's several things in my life that really excite me. And one of them is when an individual says, Keith, I wanted to go from here to there, and your Nuggets, CBT Nuggets content really helped me and assisted me in the process. They shortened the learning curve. I was able to jump into technology and learn things that I wouldn't have been able to otherwise, or I learned a lot faster, and thank you. And I'm like, oh my goodness, all of our nuggets and all of our work at CBT Nuggets to make it training easier, to make IT training accessible and functional, it's working, at least for this one person. And so We're excited about that, and that is very, very motivating to me as well. So with that, what I would like to do is let me go ahead and take a look at see if we have any questions in the queue. And also I want to thank Anthony for helping us moderate this whole thing. So we're at the 10:30 mark. Anthony, if we have any questions in the queue, can you let me know about those if you want me to take one or two? Otherwise, I'm going to turn the time over to you. And everybody who's joined us, thank you so much for joining us for this webinar on the intro to IPv4 subnetting.
Thanks everyone for joining us. Keith, that was amazing as always. I just want to take this time to remind you guys that our recording is going to be posted to our blog, blog.cbtnuggets.com. Thanks for joining us.